Voilà, bonjour.
Hello everyone. I'm going to start in Spanish. First of all, I would like to greet you all to this webinar. My name is Paul-Emile Dupré. I'm here in Brussels. I'm working at the European Parliament. And first of all, I would like to wish you a very warm welcome to this webinar in order to share the reflections of the members of regional and national parliaments from Europe, Latin America, Asia, Africa on the UN binding treaty. It is for me a great honor to moderate this webinar today with Barbara Figueroa from the Trade Union Confederation of Latin America, of the Americas. Welcome to you all, whether you are from Latin America, Africa, Asia, or
So there is interpretation to French and Spanish. You can find that in the buttons, interpretation in the menu of your Zoom window, and there you can choose the language you need. Entonces, la interpretación también está en directa.
Interpretation is also ensured in Spanish. You can interpret with by pushing on the button, choosing the toolbar, and you can pick the right language.
Activer l'option interprétation dans le menu du Zoom.
This seminar will be in translated in English and Spanish, and we do thank the interpreters for this live interpreting services. On the eve, on the 6th session of the United Nations Open-Ended Intergovernmental Working Group, the Global Interparliamentary Network for the Binding Treaty, and the Global Campaign to Reclaim People's Sovereignty, Dismantle Corporate Power, and Stop Impunity, have the great pleasure to organize this virtual conference. It is important because this is already the 6th session of the working group, and each time we organize a session to think together. That topic a few years ago was almost inexistent at the European Parliament, and today it is rather at the core of our work, and there are currently legislations that are being discussed in Europe. Today, we will have the opportunity to listen to the point of views of the ambassador of Ecuador, who is the chair of the conference. And you know that Ecuador took the initiative of this binding treaty. And also MPs from the continent to share about content, to talk about what is being done in different regions. We do think that MPs are legitimate to follow up on the crucial role played by the United Nations. They have a role to play. And by the way, 300 MPs co-signed an appeal to implement the binding treaty since October 2017, and many of them are joining that appeal. They are now supported by mobilization from local authorities all over the world. I will now give the floor to the person moderating with me, Barbara Figueroa. You have the floor, Barbara. You have the floor. Hello. Hello, everyone. Hello to those of you taking part to this very important event that I can co-moderate today. I'm very happy. My name is Barbara Figueroa. I'm chairwoman of the CUT in Chile, and I'm also in charge of different issues for the Americas. Our organization, CSA, is a member of the Global Campaign to Reclaim People's Sovereignty, Dismantle Corporate Power, and Stop Impunity. We have recognized the importance of that effort so as to make sure that those transnational corporations are made responsible of their violations of human rights in different production chains. We have put forward the work, the informal work of people not being recognized for their work. Today, this webinar is very important and we take part to it. It is important because we have high-level panelists today, and we do take part to a campaign with different trade unions, different communities that are involved and that are putting forward concrete measures, including the binding treaties. And we will also take part to the negotiations in the next weeks with the open-ended intergovernmental working group. Let me remind you that we will have a nice meeting today. We will have the ambassador representing Ecuador to the United Nations and also chairing the open-ending group on transnational cooperation and human rights. We will also have Ms. Lilian Galán, member of the Uruguayan Parliament, representing the Frente Amplio. Then we will have Mr. Zitto Kabwe. I think I'm pronouncing properly his name. He is a member of the Tanzanian Parliament. Then we will have Mr. Helmut Scholz, member of the European Parliament, from the GUE. We will also have, well, Mr. Scholz is going to present the global campaign. So thank you to you all for being here today with us for this webinar. Every panelist will have around 10 minutes for his contributions. And after the different speeches, comments, we will get a look at the different questions. You can see that in Zoom, you can put forward your questions in the Q&A tab, and then we will ask each participant of this webinar to comply with the 10 minutes rule so that we can have some Q&A sessions to have an exchange of views based on the different questions that will have been put forward by everyone. During this conference, we will make sure that you can have the different documents, the platforms. We will send you the links to the platforms with those documents. On the social networks, you will be able to follow us with the hashtag binding treaty on Twitter. And then during the whole webinar, we will be able to talk together. Excellent. I think you said it all. Everything has been said. You all know that you can put a question forward to us. And without further ado, I would like to greet the ambassador, Emilio Rafael Izquierdo Miño, who is also the president of the open-ended working group. I guess that he is working hard currently, plays a key role in a session that will also be key for the future of that treaty. Welcome, Mr. the ambassador. You have the floor. Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to welcome you all and greet you all, everyone who is attending to this webinar, to share different thoughts about a binding treaty on companies and on human rights, including to facilitate access to justice and remedy. Well, first of all, I would like to thank the Global Network and the MEP Helmut Scholz, who invited me to take part to this very important meeting today. Unfortunately, I will not be able to attend up until the very end, because after my comments, I will have to take part to another forum on this topic. I'm talking as the chair of the open-ended working group after resolution 26/9 of the Human Rights Council of the United Nations. And I would like to share information on the drafting of a binding treaty. The results and the mandate of the fifth session of the working group taking place in October 2019 and the main elements of that second draft, revised draft, which will be the basis for the direct intergovernmental negotiations that will take place during next week's session. Against that backdrop, it is important to recognize that the COVID-19 pandemic clearly impacted the whole population. It has many impacts, and we will have to address this during the next negotiations. It will have an impact on travel, and I hope that every stakeholder will be able to take part to this important process. Given the very limited time we have for the session, and with no further analysis of the new version, I wanted to share with you new information so as to promote a bigger participation of the countries to that process, and also share with you some views to contribute to the informal, open and constructive dialogue on progress, challenges and prospects of this draft treaty. This webinar today is also key in order to draw conclusions and to exchange. Also, it will be key to exchange with companies, different stakeholders, to talk about the implementation of that proposal, including the different guiding principles with regards to the legislative developments. We should see how this project could be strengthened through an international treaty on this issue. Many stakeholders participate to this forum, and I would like to remind you that the open-ended intergovernmental working group on transnational cooperation was created in 2014 under resolution 26/9 of the Council, with this mandate to create a legally binding instrument in order to regulate the business of transnational cooperation and other businesses in the international arena and for human rights. And we have already had 5 sessions, lasting each time 1 week, with a bigger and bigger participation. 100 states are represented, and there are around 400 representative of the CSO organizations, representative of International Organization for Human Rights Defense, academics, trade unions, and other stakeholders, obviously. These are unprecedented numbers, and they have been never reached for such a working group. The presentation in July 2018 of a first draft, revised draft of the treaty focused on the victims of human rights violation. In 2019, we had a new revised draft. They have been clearly recognized. The different experts recognized that these were positive steps in the right direction with a legal basis in order to carry out intergovernmental negotiation. It was confirmed during the 5th session of the working group taking place in October 2019. Comments and proposals were put forward on different articles of the first revised draft of the treaty. We could also discuss on the reflections of the different experts. They gave us also different replies to our questions about the scope, for example, definitions, rights of victims, the jurisdiction, the legal accountability, prevention, and remedies.
And here I am bouncing back on the words of the High Commissioner who inaugurated the 5th session. She recalled that this instrument would help protecting and repairing the victims who had been afflicted by this non-compliance with human rights, non-compliance by companies, and that this would allow to develop in a more sustainable and inclusive way. There is another very important point I'd like to stress here today: the clear recognition and precise recognition of the fact that activities carried out by companies which afflict human rights have consequences on many different parts of the society, and therefore, if we want to be part of, the solution to fight the uh, challenges which are faced by these victims, so that we can repair the situation. At the end of the fifth session, the report was approved, and recommendations from the chairman and the rapporteur and the working group took note of this, and a new mandate was given so that the current presidency could work on the drafting of a second project, so that it would be possible to continue the intergovernmental negotiations during the sixth session, which will start next Monday. This new version, which was sent beginning of August 2020 to the member states of the United Nations, was also sent to other important stakeholders in Geneva and was published on the website of the High Commissioner. And it was drafted on one hand on the basing ourselves on the exchanges of the fifth session, and then on the proposals, concrete proposals for amendments to the text put forward during this session, and furthermore, additional amendment proposals submitted by other stakeholders which had until February 2020 to do so. And finally, the informal exchanges in between sessions, which happened virtually in May and June this year. Furthermore, in the recommendations from the final report of the fifth session, we have asked the President Rapporteur to create a group of experts so that they could bring their expertise to the table in an independent way, and to work on a second revised project basing ourselves on paragraph 6 of Resolution 26/9. The second version of this reviewed project for the treaty has one target: define the obligations of the states which have to respect, promote, and defend human rights in the framework of activities of companies, and this is also the responsibility of companies. Furthermore, it aims at fighting and limiting violations, and furthermore, it is important to grant access to justice to the victims, and finally reinforce the judicial support and judicial legal cooperation to defend human rights and justice. Generally speaking, we think that this reviewed version is more aligned to the different instruments and frameworks which do already exist. The main principles of the United Nations are the ILO Convention on Multinationals and many other useful instruments from the ILO, such as some principles on companies and others which promote a progressive approach. On the scope, the new version adds more precisions and makes references to all human rights and fundamental freedoms which come from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and other treaties, the ILO's conclusions, which have been signed by member states, and finally, international law. Here we also talk about the Declaration of the United Nations to defend the defenders, the 2020 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the importance for member states and companies to take into account the gender dimension in their work, in line with the Convention on the Elimination of Any Discrimination Against Women and other international instruments which are useful here. Then on the scope, the new version reaffirms that it has effects on all companies, transnationals and companies which have multinational, international activities. It also gives the possibility to states to see how companies can respect some specificities depending on their dimension and the seriousness of the non-compliance with human rights. And here we can see that this is in line with 26.9, and we need to take into account the context, the rules which exist, because indeed some differences are sometimes made between different countries, and as a consequence, duties and obligations for due diligence can be different from one country to another. This has also been taken into account in other elements of the treaties for SMEs. Another important change, which answers a request from several parts of our world, is about a reference to public-owned companies in order to ensure an equal footing and access to justice for victims as well. Then on victims, the new text reintegrated some dispositions, and it also mentions that it was important to widen the recognition of victims and their network, and so on. Then on prevention, well, several points have already been improved on indigenous communities, and the notion of conflict of interest has been added, and we have also fine-tuned the sanctions on the non-compliance with due diligence without forgetting, well, the responsibility, the civil liability of the stakeholders. Then on access to reparation, after the requests we have heard during the fifth section and after the exchanges, several elements have been included. References to the abuses and references to some dispositions. We have also tried to simplify the rules on the penal responsibilities, etc., trying to take into account the different national legal frameworks. Finally, the dispositions on legal assistance have been improved, same for international cooperation, so that it would be part of international cooperation, taking into account here the principles of coherence with other instruments which already exist. The text has been improved in order to talk about the compatibility with international trade agreement existing today and which will exist tomorrow, taking into account all the respect of further treaties and instruments, as well as conventions related to human rights. Articles from the section 3 of the treaty on governance and follow-up have not been amended because during the fifth session, very few comments had been made on this section. As a consequence, we can imagine that the priority for the sixth session will be on section 1 and 2 of this reviewed project. Anyway, I want to stress the fact that, as it has been mentioned in the recommendations of the fifth session, that the sixth session should allow to lead to more concrete intergovernmental negotiations by member states in order to create a third reviewed project so that we can deliver on the mandate which had been granted by Resolution 26.9. And let me recall here that this sixth session should be organized so that all stakeholders can express their views on this treaty project. This recommendation from the chairman rapporteur from October is another example which shows that there is openness. It had already been shown during the 5th session, but we've been able to see it during the exchanges in between sessions. This is a need which has been identified by the presidency, and it has been stressed by different stakeholders. It is important to widen the dialogue, to learn from each other, and to take into account the existing experiences which come from the national and international level, so that we can facilitate and promote different initiatives at the national level in favor of human rights, or for example in universities as well, or in different centra with trade unions as well, and also in order to try to create alliances and work with alliances who are already active on human rights, some alliances which would maybe like to contribute to this process. Let me also recall, as I've been doing since October from last year, that I would like to thank the different stakeholders who have contributed one way or another to this process. And I encourage all of those who have not contributed yet to this process to do so. We want to encourage you to encourage your governments to take actions to seize this unique opportunity to create an international framework which will fill this gap which exists on human rights, and which will contribute significantly to reinforcing the respect, the promotion and the protection of human rights by companies, and which will allow to create an international cooperation which will be reinforced in this context. Thank you for your attention. And as I have said earlier, sorry, but I won't be able to stay at this meeting because I need to leave for another meeting to tackle, well, this issue. Thanks again.
Agradecemos al señor embajador. Perdón, Paul, perdón. Agradecemos
No, quería
al
saber
señor.
Very much.
si tiene todavía algunos minutos el señor embajador, porque recién
Well,
una pregunta.
I was wondering whether the ambassador might have a few more minutes, because I received a question on some stakeholders of the European Union. Is the European Union more involved in that text? Is it having a more active participation? What is its role? And in a broader way, is the ambassador optimistic? I don't know whether you have some more time. Yes, of course, I have a few more minutes. I can answer those questions with no doubt. Since I assumed this responsibility as the representative of the Equator to the United Nations, I accepted that responsibility, of course, to steer this effort through my chairmanship of that working group. I tried to dialogue with all the member countries of the United Nations so that they can participate to this effort, not only physically, just being there, but also to take part to the deep analysis of this draft treaty. I make sure that all the countries can be represented, but also that they can contribute actively to the text which will be dealt with during the 6th session. We will start negotiations. We will have to work on the language, on the drafting. And I'm always optimistic, always. I have always received clear answers from many countries. I'm in touch with all those countries, and I had a lot of feedback on this proposal for a binding treaty. I also tried to find compromises to align the different point of views so that we could have a good participation to that process. Also, for the European Union, I can say proudly that I'm very optimistic. I hope that the European Union will keep on working as it did during the 5th session. Of course, the European Union showed its interest for the different segments of that project. That's the case also for other regions, by the way. I tried to integrate as many countries as possible so that they take part to that effort. This is the responsibility of the international community. And especially today, given the current global situation we are all facing today, I think that this international approach is even more important. Multilateralism is key today in order to address such situations affecting humans, people. We are talking about human rights, and people are at the heart, at the core of that effort. All the countries need to be involved. They should participate with their proposals. That's my answer to your questions. Again, apologize. I'm not able to stay any longer to this meeting. Well, good luck to you. Good luck and success in your work. And thank you for being here. We thank indeed the ambassador. Thank you for your contribution and thank you for replying to this question. It was very important. And as the ambassador told us, the civil society organizations need to take part to that effort. The different stakeholders need to take ownership of this effort so that they can put forward their proposals, so that everyone understands the real challenge that we put forward with the binding treaty and its implementation, so as to be able to protect the different people and workers. And now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Lilian Galán, who is representing the Uruguayan Parliament. You have the floor, madam. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Barbara. Thanks to you all for inviting me. It's an honor and a real pleasure for me to be here with you and to exchange with the different MPs. That's a shame that Mr. Santiago from Malaysia is not able to be here with us today. We were already able to talk with him previously in the past, and he already took part to discussions, to interparliamentary discussions on this binding treaty. There will be two parts to my intervention. Firstly, I will deal with the vision on this treaty through the current situation in my country, and then I will talk about the draft that will be at the core of the 6th session. First of all, how do we consider this project, this draft, given the situation in my country? You might know that we have now a different government. I was introduced as a member of the Frente Amplio. My party was leading the country for the last 15 years, but in November last year, we lost elections faced with a coalition of 5 right-wing neoliberal parties. Situation changed a lot today in Uruguay. Today, I think that we can say that everything that had been done in the last years in Uruguay, during the last years, was very interesting, very fruitful. I took part myself to the negotiations in Geneva. I supported the ambassador on those efforts. And in Uruguay, we worked with different MPs in order to support the person in charge of this work. Also to create a working group with the different social organizations in my country. We also liaise with the different ministries responsible for development, production, and working with the different transnational corporations in my country. It was a very fruitful work. We could exchange a lot. We could elaborate a lot of content, but nowadays this working group has been stopped because of that change of government. Today, the current government does not really want to support this draft for a binding treaty. The government is rather in favor of transnational cooperation. Let me give you an example. There are big CEOs of transnational corporations are now heading national corporations, public corporations. Just to give you an idea of the current situation, the goals that we tried to reach, aiming at supporting the binding treaty, will not be the same anymore in Uruguay. Today, transnational corporations go beyond the economic power spheres in many countries, in developed countries, and even more so in small-sized countries such as mine, belonging to a very complex region. This is the case of Latin America. It is a very complex region. You need to know that there are, Latin America is the most unequal continent, and even more so with the pandemic. The pressure on the distributing channels and the relationships with the financial sectors makes them very important stakeholders with a clear power. They are able to influence drafting of laws. Sometimes they are even at the governments. There are MPs that are trying to gag different governments. We have different examples in Uruguay showing the power of those peoples, the relationships between different stakeholders, supporting, for example, universities through funding. They have think tanks, also they fund think tanks. A few days ago, I made a speech in the Parliament in Uruguay. We were talking about the national budget. I tried really to act as a whistleblower, to really raise the alarm. When we drafted the national budget, we will use that budget for the next 5 years. I wanted to make sure that the government explains how it will fund the different social policies in the countries. I wanted explanations. We have a study center. It is composed of different politicians and responsible officials working in the government. But it's not the main problem. The main problem is that this center is recognized as an institution by the government. It is funded, it is working with the Atlas network. It is a neoliberal network that is funded by transnational corporations, big corporation at that, of course. They are also supported by the United States government. So, if you add to that businessmen and women, officials in charge of big corporations that are within the executive government in Uruguay, we have the example of Movistar, a big company. Today, they are chairing the National Communications Company. This is a clear problem. Everyone can understand that. It is today deeply rooted within the states, and that's a real issue. Today, the states are able to define their abilities, and more often than not, we see that there is a lot of opacity in the relationship with big transnational corporations. That's why we need to have rules so that we can set limits transparency rules to clearly put some light on this opacity. No one votes to elect the members of the board of this transnational corporation, yet they take decisions having big impact on people. We saw that in Uruguay. Uruguay is a small country, and clearly we are the first to defend international law. Obviously, we support the different opportunities, and we want them to be included in our state. What should be Uruguay's position, stance in the next negotiations? Unfortunately, no one can tell the future, and we know that the current international situation is really complicated. That's why I was referring to the current situation. We have different political measures. In Brazil, for example, we have countries with a neoliberal approach. Those elements have to be taken into account for the next meeting, on top of the pandemic context. It is crystal clear that the working group under Resolution 26/9 should be maintained and should keep on focus on its main goals. We need to fight against the superpowers of those super corporations. The states are controlled by those corporations, and sometimes also they are put under the pressure of those corporations. And with a difficult economic situation because of the pandemic, those corporations are supporting vulnerable countries. I think that we will not be able to make progress on all the important points for us, even though our proposal is really fair. And therefore, I think that we need to have a strategy so as to make progress. Clearly, we think that this initiative should be maintained. It should not disappear. It should not be also weakened, and a working group needs to keep on working.
We think it's the right moment to go forward, and we should not put an end to our work by signing a treaty, bearing into account the situation and the pandemic, which does not allow for people to meet, and states and representatives of civil society to be around the table. We think it is fundamental to listen to the member states, but also to civil society, which is organized. We have already seen it in other times, and we think it is paramount to listen to civil society, not only in Geneva, but also in our countries. I said it earlier, the meetings we are holding with civil society, with different working groups, with the different ministries. Well, these meetings cannot happen anymore because of the situation in Uruguay, not taking into account the pandemic. So we think that our strategy must aim at keeping working, organizing meeting, and working until better days arise, because we need to be able to dig into details and to have correct conditions and fair conditions for everyone. Let me now talk about a couple of points. I have some time left, right, Barbara? Well, I'll reach my conclusion then. Thank you. I'll try to wrap it up. I just wanted to mention 4 points. 4 points for this reviewed project, 4 points which are very important to us. First, we need to guarantee the respect of international law and norms on human rights, and we must make sure that these rules prevail over trade agreements. Then we must ensure that the scope of this treaty focuses on multinational companies, and that they are not mixed up because public companies are not on an equal footing with multinational, and they are not on an equal footing because conditions are asymmetrical. I won't explain everything because I don't have enough time, but I would have loved to give you more explanations. Then this second project puts a bit too much responsibility on member states, although we do know that we are talking about weak states when facing such multinationals, or states which are under pressure and under the grasp even of these multinationals, especially today with the pandemic. We also want to insist on the importance of human rights and insist on the fact that we need references to the national framework so that different levels of power and law cannot be opposed to each other. Then we need a contract and a good relationship. It is very hard to show there is a relationship between subcontractors, sister companies, and etc. And we have already talked about this over the last few years, and these relationships are particularly complex. But I think that in the text of this treaty, we should talk about maybe relationship between companies, about value chains, about circuits. This is more concrete and would well allow us to build bridges between these entities. I would also like us in this binding treaty to recognize the different communities and the victims, not only direct victims, as it has been said by Mr. Ambassador earlier, but we should recognize the associations, the groups of people which are uh, suffering, including associations defending human rights, because we do know that those who are directly attacked cannot act by themselves. We are talking about huge lacks of balances between multinationals and the victims. Thank you very much. Thank you, Barbara, and sorry for being so long. Well, thank you very much for this presentation. And with what happened in Bolivia this week and what's happening now, it is pitiful. Here in the chat, I see that there are several questions, and actually, well, you are close. Well, we are aware of all of this, and we've had many contacts with the European Parliament, but also with the group. We have organized this group at the Parliament of Mercosur, and the MPs have taken part in the work, and we have a discussion group on the binding treaty. We've had several exchanges on this, and we tried to organize exchanges with organizations defending human rights in Argentina and elsewhere. You know our relationship with Manuel Roland, and we try to work so that Parliament and the Parasur will take part to the works on the binding treaty. We have signed the very first document. MPs from Parasur have signed it, our group has signed it, and we have been amongst the first to sign this document. Let me repeat it. And we will continue working with social organizations, civil society, and the Parliament, the Progressist group, and civil society as well. But we have lost some support because But we will continue trying to build bridges and carry out analysis to revamp our proposals as a country. We have already organized interministerial meetings with different ministries which take into account development, economics, and social policies. Thanks to these exchanges and the experience built over the last few years, over the last 6 or 7 years, I'd say, well, we've been able to go forward, and now we will continue working only with the left-wing coalition, social organizations, because today the situation is very problematic with our countries. All the human rights which we got back, to say so, with the government of our party are now being dismantled. So these times are very harsh for workers in my country. Wages have been reduced, and furthermore, public policies are eroded in education, and so on. There were some transfers for precarious sectors, and today it is becoming worse and worse. So with our working group, we have created cooperatives, but cooperatives don't have public money anymore, and so there are less and less human resources. The policies are unfair, and we've had 5 deaths because of the cold during the pandemic. People who were homeless, and although our country was really inclusive, so this situation is worrisome. We see that human rights are being dismantled and workers' rights too. So I can tell you that members of multinationals are now the owners of the public companies. So we will strike to defend public companies, because in the 90s we wanted to some wanted to privatize, and we won the battle back in the day. But now we will fight again to defend human rights and to defend public companies, because it is fundamental for the development of a country which is so tiny as Uruguay. So that's it for the situation at home, which is really complex. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lilian. And we are sure that you will continue very active in this fight. We had Zitto Kabwe. He tried to connect, but now he's not connected. So I propose to begin to give the floor directly to Helmut Scholz from the European Parliament, also because Helmut is in the process of voting. So Helmut Scholz, who is following very closely the issue for years now in the UN and also inside the legislation that are discussed inside the European Parliament. So Helmut, the floor is yours. Welcome. Helmut? I see that Helmut is not connected now, so I would give the floor to Monica, maybe. Monica Vargas from the Global Campaign.
Yes. Yes, sorry. Thank you, Paul-Emile. Actually, we were going to ask to Gonzalo Berrón from the Transnational Institute and the Global Campaign to Dismantle Corporate Power to give us a brief update on the activities that are being prepared, as well as the political strategy developed by the Global Campaign towards the binding treaty next week. So perhaps while Helmut is joining us, we can ask Gonzalo to intervene now, if it's fine. Gonzalo?
Sure. Gonzalo, the floor is yours.
Yes. Thank you. I was trying to fix my interpretation settings. Voy a hablar en español. Okay?
And I'll speak in Spanish. Of course you can. Of course you can start.
Then you have to go to be in the channel of Spanish, to be sure that the translation is in Spanish also.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Welcome, and the floor is yours.
La parole.
Okay, muchas gracias. Quiero saludar a los
Thank you very much.
en particular por su compromiso con la
I would like to thank Lilian for her commitment and for the effort, all the efforts carried out. I would like to thank our colleague from CCA from Chile. And I would like to thank you as well, obviously, Paul-Emile. And now I would like to give you a brief update on this campaign we are developing for this session. It's a paramount session in our opinion, because we have the impression that we are reaching a final dot after 5 or 6 years work, and we wanted to congratulate everyone for the resilience of the last few years. We've seen that some stakeholders have changed a lot because this process is tricky, and we count on
What we have been able to see is that it has been raised already, and we have clearly a growing separation between the original reasons behind the treaty and the current form of the treaty. The treaty is becoming a normal human rights treaty. What does that mean? It means that all the standards, all the energy we have is carried out at the state level. The state have all the responsibilities, even the international responsibilities. Everything depends on the state cooperation. That's fine, because in a way, with that structure, we can put many key issues. We can contribute with many topics such as victims' rights, and many other elements relating to our efforts. They are, of course, necessary, of paramount importance, and victims' organizations brought their contributions. Today, at the international level, we have still a big vacuum. That's why the treaty is extremely necessary. Everything that is associated with the supremacy of human rights, the obligations of transnational corporations that do not depend on national jurisdictions. These are obligations, international obligations of transnational corporations. And we need to ensure consistency with that direct obligation of corporations. As has been said by the previous speakers, there is a broadening of the scope to all the companies. It is quite logical and consistent, because the treaty is then applied as a national law. But it is not consistent with the spirit of, at first, of the resolution 26/9. It was to deal with the problems raised by multinationals. And no, this treaty gives some room for maneuver to those big corporations. We are going to do it all in order to improve the text through the different proposals we put forward, by sending a new drafting new articles, new proposals for articles to influence the text. We want to push the treaty in that direction with all members and colleagues. It's not easy, of course, especially given the very peculiar context for this session. At first, we asked for to transform this session into a consultation process to understand this new normal. We do think that we are clearly at a disadvantage to participate to such a session. We are really worried about that. Lately, we have had a meeting with our colleagues of the Sun Center. They told us that the Human Rights Council in Geneva is dead. Why? Because the civil society is not attending. It is the civil society which brings momentum to the Human Rights Council, which raises the main issues. That's why we are deeply worried about the current trend. We are worried about the future after the sixth session. The hybrid format clearly has many gaps for participation, for example. We all know that. And when we have to negotiate a treaty, such an important treaty, it is becoming clearly problematic. It is even more complicated for civil society, we are representing now, but also for the different states. Indeed, the states have less opportunities to organize, to mobilize their resources, their staff, and so on and so forth. Many complaints were raised on this issue, and we organized many activities with the different campaign documents. We will also organize a press meeting on next Tuesday, as usual. It will only be virtual, unfortunately, only through the internet. We are a mobilization campaign, a campaign of real people for real people, and therefore we are facing a big gap, and we want clearly to insist to the group chair and to the other members that negotiations with the different states should take into account those problems and the current context. And we should be wary of taking too drastic measures. As you know, we will have a virtual presence, but at least we have some visibility. It's not enough, of course, compared to our previous efforts and to the amount of work that we can do, and all work is key, because this treaty is also negotiated at the state level. That's why parliaments play a key role. What Lilian said is of paramount importance. Another participant said that as well. The parliament should be involved from the very outset. I welcome the work that has been carried out by the Global Interparliamentary Network, which help us to organize a meeting with the Human Rights Council in Brazil, in Uruguay, in Argentina. It's something new, clearly, because we want to have our colleague Uwash, the General Secretary of the CTA, who is now an MP in Brazil, Valerie Calmato, also from Uruguay, Mr. Salomon in Brazil, so that they can take part to the meeting, the tripartite meeting. And we clearly hope that this meeting can be associated to the treaty process and to the efforts made by Monica and Paul-Emile to keep on moving. Thank you very much. And I'm with you in those discussions. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gonzalo Barron, for your comments. Thank you very much for giving us an update on the activities of the campaign. Thank you very much, Gonzalo. So clearly, we see the importance of MPs as clearly a safeguard on the role of the different public policies, on the role of the states for legally binding treaties in order to defend human rights. When it comes to the impunity of multinationals, we have to fight against that. States and Parliament play a key role, of course. So thank you very much for Helmut Scholz to be here with us. I hope that I'm not mistaken that he is here with us. I hope that I properly pronounce your name, but he is MEP and he's represented the Grey Group, the United European Left. And you have 10 minutes for your comments. Thank you very much, Helmut, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you all for having invited me to participate in this very important meeting today, even if it is under conditions which we all would have preferred to be in Geneva taking place, so that we are seeing each other in person and that we can discuss what is burning on our shoulders and our mouths, etc., so that we are really discussed to the core of the problem. But nevertheless, we have the chance to meet via this digital format, and maybe we should, general remark, think much more about using this format for having a more concrete and precise exchange of views on the one or the other aspect between parliamentarians, between civil society organizations, representatives, interested citizens in the whole process, and maybe not only on this process, but in general. I think we have to increase the democratic accompanying of policy making in a worldwide understanding and solidarity and openness and frankness. You all know that the European Parliament is from the beginning of this negotiations round in Geneva trying to accompany the struggle of those for whom the treaty should be developed and should be agreed on, so that we as representatives of directly elected representatives in 27 member states of the European Union have the obligations to link the social struggles, the struggles for human rights and democracy, for peace, with the questions, what is behind the curtains really happening? Why these values we are striving for are not realized? So why we have this gap between the North and the South? And I want to thank Lilian in particular for giving us a current picture about the struggles in Uruguay and in South America. Therefore, over 300 parliamentarians from the European Parliament as well as from national parliaments and sometimes even regional parliaments have signed an appeal, and we are just now in the modernization of the appeal for this 6th round, which is covering the new developments. And we have to highlight that this binding treaty is obligatory, is necessary to balance the unfair consequences of unregulated globalization. And this unbalanced globalization has for decades already generated asymmetries between states, communities, individuals and corporations in terms of access to justice and the protections of people's human rights, in particular in the poorest regions of the world. But these poorest regions of the world are only the worst example for this gap. This gap is also within the European Union. And in different regions, and even in the rich Germany, we have more than 2 million children under the poverty border. And that, I think, is unthinkable. So we have to think why we have this structure. And just these days in Frankfurt am Main, the very well-known Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen has got the Peace Prize from the German Book Association, which is a very prestigious award for his work, and in particular for his book, The Development as Freedom. And it is in the German translation maybe even better expressed as a title, because in German it is published just now under Economy for the People. And here I think we have one scientific basis which is giving in our struggle for the United Nations binding treaty process some stuff for thinking, how we are have to reorganize the economy and give a certain role to the transnationals, but not only to the transnational, but all undertakings and enterprises playing a dominant role in the economy, how it is functioning. There could be a lot of discussions on this subject. I want to go into the length on that. But in the European Parliament, we are currently, in view of this United Nations binding treaty process negotiation in Geneva, also debating what should be changed here. In our responsibility as of one of the most developed regions in the world, imposing by its economic power also the questions of life and death in other regions of the world, on the due diligence legislation, which is incorporating the human rights issue, the environmental aspects, and the social and employment issues into the responsibility of corporations and undertaking, including SMEs, saying in the whole value and supply chain, we have to take into notification of European legislators how the framework for the activities of business should be look like and should be shaped. And therefore, I want to inform you about this ongoing struggle. And there is just now already the first initiative report on this on the way. And in spring next year, the Commission has obliged to publish its own communication for a binding legislation in this direction. So what we are now doing in the Parliament is to give a certain guideline for this communication of the Commission, which is reacting on the current pressure taking place internationally. And therefore, I want to link the both struggles very closely together. And I hope that with these reflections, we will be able to win more support by parliamentarians to come into this process. And I want to thank all the NGOs, networks, the Transnational Institute Barbara in particular, for being a driving engine in this process, not to lose the ability to focus on the most burning issues. And as the ambassador today, this morning, has informed, as a first speaker, that there must be the questions of remedies tackled still, that there must be more questions tackled with the subcomponents valuable to the general obligations, to the liability. I think we have maybe to discuss also among us how it should really look like, how it should function, so that corporations, and in particular, I agree with that, the transnationals could be made obliged to follow this treaty. So who will then take care? And then we have to deal with the fact what we have discussed during the 4th and the 5th round already in Geneva, and I remember very well our debates, how we establish this control. Who will control it? Who is then the final judge about the implementation of the treaty if we have reached it? So this question of the binding treaty process negotiations must be, from my point of view, immediately linked also to the struggle of all together of us to think over how we are managing the follow-up process. So that today it's already clear what we are incorporating into this treaty, and there are the ministers. And I think that it should be also kept, this principle of the form of negotiations, to link the official representatives of the states in the CHRC with the participation of yours, of the global campaign, because that is unique in this approach in a certain way. And here I think it is also the surplus of this form of negotiation, and we have to bring it back to the reality, in particular also of the member states. In the in the first bigger hearing on the trade policy review of the European Union, the new Commissioner for International Trade, Dombrovskis, confessed that he is ready to reassess a stronger commitment of the European Union to these negotiations. So we will see what the delegation is really doing in Geneva next week. And I hope that even under the COVID-19 situation, we should organize in the next days a very close interlinkage among us to accompany these negotiations, see what the different and various states are bringing in, and what we can use and again in the parliamentarian struggle for going into the direction we are discussing and what we are calling for. So I see that this is a requirement. I speak out towards us, the parliamentarians, at the different levels, but it is also a requirement to you as representatives from the civil society. And I'm very hopeful, I'm very optimistic that we will have in the 6th round a certain step forward in going into more detailed, structured and incorporated new formulations in these negotiations. And the public is the best judge for that. And so we have to establish transparency, we have to establish close links among us, and we have to establish a vision in which direction the struggle for the United Nations binding treaty should be continued in the probably next round of the negotiations, because the 6th round will not be the final breakthrough. We have to increase our efforts, we have to increase our forces, we have to broaden up the front of those who are striving for this very important struggle in the interest of the people everywhere. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Helmut. Effectivement.
Thank you, Helmut. Indeed, what you are showing here is that at the European Parliament, this month is very important on key documents on due diligence and so on. And furthermore, the week in Geneva will be very important. And thank you for your proposal. Thank you for suggesting to the network to keep in touch with the different organizations, to beware, to be very cautious, so that we can react if need be. So obviously we'll keep in touch now. We were supposed to listen to Charles Santiago from Malaysia. He's president of ASEAN, but unfortunately we learned that there is a major political crisis in Malaysia, and as a consequence, for the very first time in years, he won't be able to join us. At least not today. I guess that in the coming days, he will be in touch with us, and unfortunately, we won't hear him today, so we obviously excuse him, but the crisis is huge. I think it's a major financial scandal which has international repercussions. So since we have a very short period of time left, let's move on to Barbara so that she can wrap up, and then I'll take the floor once again. Barbara, you have the floor.
Muchas gracias, Paul. Bueno, agradecer en primer lugar.
Thank you very much, Paul. First of all, I would like to thank all of you who have been taking part in this webinar. I would like to thank the members of the panel for their comments. It helped us to broaden our view. It helped also to broaden the discussions. It also helps to support the implementation of these instruments in order to have a binding treaty by involving the different states, the civil society, the trade unions, and the other stakeholders. As the MEP Helmut Scholz explained, the aim is to make sure that those instruments will help us implement respected standards in order to guarantee human dignity. This is the stake, after all, of the binding treaty. It is not only about having economic exchanging with the different countries. We need to reinforce, strengthen human dignity and respect of human rights. This is the reason why we should make progress with the binding treaty, allowing us to implement systems to strengthen the existing structures with transnational corporations, and which will enable us to strengthen the impact of the existing norms, and also to make sure that well-behaving companies are recognized, because all companies are not the same. Of course, we are talking here about transnational corporations. It has to be mentioned. Based on what we heard today, it is important to mention that transnational corporations must respect human rights. That is of paramount importance. Standards have direct impacts, and they help us address the legal gaps that we have today. I do think that we have to think also about the different supply chains. We need to define them properly. In doing so, we will be able to protect ourselves. We will also be able to protect the whole supply chain, and also make sure that we can produce while respecting the different standards, and also fight against impunity when it comes to human rights violations. We should also mention international institutions. That could be established in order to protect human rights. We have the campaign, and the campaign is mentioning the possibility to have an international court in order to apply sanctions if big transnational corporations violate human rights. This is a big task ahead of us. It is important then, and it has been mentioned by Lilian, it is a very complicated point. We are currently seeing that some board members of big corporations become member of parliament, the so-called revolving door process. It is questioning the role clearly of national governments and the respect for human rights. It is a very sensitive issue. It is a very important one at that, and I do think that all the stakeholders need to take into account all those elements in order to protect human rights. You all mentioned it. The COVID-19 pandemic is problematic, is raising many difficulties. CSOs were already struggling to have an active participation, and today, with the COVID-19 pandemic at the international level, we need to show more innovation. We need to be more inventive in order to promote our fight, in order to take part in an active way to those negotiations, so that all the debates organized today and in the future are fruitful and are also enriched by our contributions. By next week, we need to make sure that we can attend, we can take part, even though we cannot travel. All the stakeholders need to be able to take part properly, state representative, parliament representatives, and all the different counterpowers as well, in order to have a proper democracy when we negotiate that binding treaty. We need to make sure that the trade unions, the civil society voices are heard. It has been mentioned already by the previous panelists. I think that we raised the main issues. Of course, we might not have covered everything, but it is clear that with all that was mentioned today, we have covered the main issues. I think that it was a rich discussion, and it will enlighten our positions in the future. It was important. It was my tiny conclusions in order to conclude that webinar. Thank you very much. We have a last question that has just been asked on the chat. I don't know whether Gonzalo or comrade from CTA is able to answer that question. The person is wondering which countries are in favor of that treaty. Gonzalo. Well, actually, I was replying with the chat. And of course, if you give the floor, I'm going to answer orally to that question. It is a comrade from Argentina who is putting that question, and I thank him for it. As you know, we have the guardians of the treaty. These are the most proactive countries. Those are the countries which ferociously struggled in that effort. On top of Ecuador, which was the beacon for that effort, different countries were also involved, such as Venezuela, Cuba, Bolivia. All of them are always very active in that effort. Also African countries, South Africa, Mozambique, Namibia, Algeria, Egypt took part. Palestine also actively took part to that effort. Malaysia, the Philippines as well. There are other countries then which supported the original vote with Russia, India, China, which are interested but raise many issues, questions. We have the guardian countries in favor of that approach. There are the real engines behind it, following Ecuador. The other countries are more tepid, let's say, are less active. And on top of these dynamic countries, all the other countries are taking part in the efforts. During the last sessions, we have had more than 90 countries involved in the discussions. Some are putting forward an article, some others are taking a stance, and this is clearly the advantage of having a first draft. When you have a text, countries have to give their opinion. And for a country, it is easier to comment on something than to put forward a proposal. Some countries were a bit wary, obviously, at first, but then after some time, they they made some comments. We are no longer discussing about the timeliness of that treaty, rather the adequacy of the treaty. Now we are discussing about the content of the treaty, and the countries are participating very actively. That's it for me. Thank you very much, Gonzalo. Thank you for your explanation. We have other questions, but unfortunately we can not continue talking together, but we will be very active. We will continue our efforts together in the future. I have to conclude the meeting today. I will be very brief. I would like to thank you all. It was a meeting of the different stakeholders. We have had the chair of the open-ended intergovernmental working group. It was a very interesting comment. Then we have had MPs from different countries talking about their country situation, talking about the United Nations, the different efforts in the GIN. We have also had the active participations of trade unions, of NGOs, of different associations. These are the engine behind this effort in order to have a treaty. We hope to have that treaty, obviously, but we do not want to go too fast, having a useless treaty. We should take some time so that we have an efficient and binding treaty. I would like to thank you all for your participation, and let me also announce that the next week will be very busy. We will have other meetings, and on the 27th of October, on Tuesday, we will publish an article in the Financial Times. And the idea is to present a network of elected peoples, of mayors, of different stakeholders. It will be made published. This is the appeal of parliamentarians, but also of local elected people who have responsibilities towards their local areas and who are in favor of a binding treaty. We will also have a press conference at 1 o'clock on Tuesday with different MEPs, different MPs, different members of the global campaign. I invite you all to have a look at the website. You will be able to find information there if you were not able to find all the answers you were looking for. You have also the websites of the different MEPs or national MPs supporting the proposal for a binding treaty. On top of the panelists, I would like also to thank the interpreters, and the interpreters thank you as well. And please note down the links that are in the chat, and I would ask you to be on the lookout for the different evolutions in your countries in the next weeks. We stay in touch, of course, and we will see what are the next steps. Thank you very much to you all. And I also wanted to say goodbye, to thank you. Be safe and take care of yourself and of your closest kin and with that pandemic. And we hope that we will be able to see each other physically for the next meeting in Geneva. I think that we will make progress and we will have a useful treaty, helpful for the peoples in order to fight against the abusive powers of transnational corporations. Goodbye.
Gracias, Lilian.
Chao.
Un abrazo.
Chao.
Muchas gracias.
Au revoir, bon après-midi.